Welcome to the Roving Nature Podcast, where we'll explore all things nature and conservation in the great state of North Carolina and beyond. I'm your host, Matt Bryant, and I invite you to join me as we hear from guests who are passionate about nature and who have made it a significant part of their work, creativity, or personal lives. And I encourage you to learn along with me as we celebrate our deep bond and relationship to our natural world.
On this beautiful day outside.
Today we're talking to Dr. Ken Bridle, who's been a professional botanist for over 4 decades and who has focused on plant physiology. His expansive career includes working as a natural heritage and watershed inventory biologist, a field ecologist, science museum exhibits director, and environmental consultant. Ken is the author of several county natural heritage inventories, as well as watershed assessments, wetland delineations, and rare plant and animal surveys. He is a frequent leader of hikes and nature walks and speaks often on local North Carolina conservation issues. Ken recently retired as the stewardship director for the Piedmont Land Conservancy, but is still conservation advisor there and continues to shepherd various projects for which he has had a hand in building. He is one of the lead instructors and founders of the new Northwest Piedmont Master Naturalist program, an awesome program that I am honored and excited to be a part of. Ken has served on the state's Wildlife Resources Commission Non-Game Wildlife Advisory Committee and is a past president of the North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council. He is a founding member of the Dan River Basin Association, Carolina Butterfly Society, and the Triad Mushroom Club, and is a 3-term president of the state's Native Plant Society. The first term was 24 years ago. When he isn't leading organizations, walks, watershed assessments, classes, or out building trail bridges and conducting rare animal and plant surveys, Ken is helping to relocate or save entire populations of wildlife. As an example of the latter, he was involved in rescuing a population of native southern brook trout from a damaged stream and relocating them to a clean habitat on Piedmont Land Conservancy property. One would be hard-pressed to find some aspect of conservation within North Carolina that Ken has not been a part of or has had an influence on, and I'm thrilled to have him as a guest on the show. I'm here talking to Ken today on his beautiful property in the town of Walnut Cove in Stokes County, North Carolina. We're sitting on what Ken described to me as his Walden Pond. This is such a lovely place, and it's a beautiful fall day as the sunlight fades and the colors of the trees and leaves are just starting to show. Thank you, Ken, for being here and agreeing to being a guest on the new podcast.
You're welcome.
We're sitting here on Ken's beautiful property on a beautiful fall day. We just had our first real front come through. The leaves are starting to change. Absolutely beautiful. I'm just in awe of this spot. And I think that's a great place for us to start. I was wondering if you could tell us about what's the magic about this place? What drew you to this place? What's special about it?
My wife and I met in graduate school at Wake, and once we decided we were going to get married, we were thinking about where would we want to live because we were still in graduate school. So we wanted to be somewhere within driving distance of Winston-Salem, but we didn't want to be on the freeway corridors. So we looked around, and all the graduate students at Wake spend a lot of time coming up to Hanging Rock State Park, which is only 3 miles as the crow flies from here, and the Dan River. So we already knew this was a recreational place that we wanted to be, so we were just looking for a piece of property to build a passive solar house on. We built a version of the NC State solar house, 7 degrees east of south, so it warms up in the winter and doesn't heat up in the summer. And it turned out to be a great place to live because we both have been very active at Hanging Rock State Park. My wife has been on the PAC advisory board. She's been the chairman for like 25 years. Before the Piedmont Land Conservancy, I was involved with the Native Plant Society, which is the oldest conservation organization in North Carolina, the second oldest native plant society on the continent. And then we got involved with the people who were doing Dan River Basin canoe access. At the time it was the Friends of the Dan and Mayo River, and that preceded Dan River Basin Association. So those guys got us interested in being on the board and whatever, and then ultimately we were on the committee that formed the Dan River Basin Association. And then shortly after that I got involved with some folks and we formed the Carolina Butterfly Society while doing inventory work around here for the Piedmont Land Conservancy. So I've been in all the big woods, I've been up and down all the creeks, I've met everybody's dog in everybody's backyard. I know where people throw their landscaping over the fence into the neighbor's unused property, but I also know where all the nice wetlands and streams are. In 2000, I published the county inventory for Forsyth and Stokes at the same time. And then I started getting calls from engineering companies that were saying, we're doing the bypass on Winston-Salem, and there's rare plants and animals there, and do you know anything? Can you help us find them? And I would do contract work for them. And finally, one of the engineering companies decided that it would be better for them if they just hired me full time. So then I was on the board of the Land Conservancy at the time and doing contract work for all these road building and development corporations and whatever, and looking for rare plants and animals. Waters of the U.S., because I got certified by the Army Corps to do wetland delineation and stream classification. And it just turned out to be, when you use your inventory biology knowledge, you can point people to where there's good mitigation sites that they can then do mitigation banking or stream restoration or whatever. Because I had a list of all the cool wetlands, and then the ones that are really worth saving, we put in the heritage inventory. The rest of them were all like the stuff the engineering companies want, because they wanted to find something that they could plug up the ditches or remove the invasive plants and replant and wind up enhancing a wetland and get credit for it. Turns out Stokes County is nice ecologically because with the Blue Ridge nearby and the Sourtown Mountains here, we're the southern edge of the northern flora, and we're kind of the northern edge of the southern flora when you go further down into the Piedmont. So it's just been a great spot. Luann and I like to integrate ourselves into the community. So I've been the president of the local arts council. My wife is involved with the senior center. She's involved with the East Stokes Outreach Ministry. So we just get involved with our little community and do things. I was the MC at the Stokes Stomp for like 25 years straight. They used to have a little parade that would come into Danbury and then end at Moratuck Park where the Stokes Stomp occurred. And prior to me, they would always get some like radio disc jockey or somebody to come and be the MC. Well, these guys didn't realize that once the parade is coming through town, so if you come late, you're not getting there on time. So it was one of these things, somebody just handed me a script and said, you can read? So I said, okay, I'll read. So just being involved with our community and, pestering people about litter on the roads and what do we do for scenic byways. And then I've been asked to be on a lot of committees here, Forsyth and Sturry and Stokes. So like economic development for recreational purposes, economic development and planning committees, and stuff like the Mountains to Sea Trail is coming through here. There's a lot of interesting things that are done because Stokes County will never be a industrial heartland, but they do have, it's about almost 1 million people come up every year to visit Hanging Rock. And if we had little bed and breakfasts and little restaurants, then people would open up their wallets and spend money. So I think that's kind of taken off. We just like it here. It's the topography is nice. It gives me a lot of opportunities. What was a big cornfield when we first moved in is now terraced gardens. So we've got a very large edible landscape plan. And then since I've been on a Native Plant Society, either the president, the board, and now the president again over the last 20 years, it's a good place to plant native plants. And at one point we figured, well, let's make a lake. And we have we got a spring over there that's at the same level as the base of our well. And then we've got another watershed coming in there. And there's a third one coming in over the side. So it turned out to be a good place to put one dam across 3 lobes and make a little lake here. So I had the engineers, when I was working at the engineering company, they drew up all the plans. And we took a bunch of soil from the top of the hill here and made the dam. And mostly it's just for wildlife. We like having a nice water body on the property. And then our property goes all the way down to another half mile to Zilphy Creek, and then Zilphy Creek goes almost immediately into the Dan River.
It was at this moment that a bird circling high overhead caught both our ear and our eye. I love moments like this where you get distracted by wildlife when you're doing something else. The best kind of distraction of all.
What is that? A little hawk of some sort. Sure is. It's not a red tail. Yeah, we get kingfishers here a lot. We get herons a lot. I had a couple of boxes with wood ducks, and so yeah, it's been a nice place to live. We got nice neighbors. We've been here 40 years.
This is not only your home, but it also seems like it's a culmination for you to apply and enjoy all the things that you've done and learned in like all these other areas of your life and your career.
It is. Well, I come from a long line of gardeners. So I had a grandmother who had a little tiny city lot near Cleveland, Ohio, and she was constantly moving things around because she was impatient. If it didn't do well here, she dug it up and moved it somewhere else. And then my father had a suburban 1.5 acres, and at one point he built a pond, and we would ice skate on the pond, and he was always interested in some kind of landscaping or whatever. So this just gives me more opportunity to build on that tradition. So yeah, we've planted lots of native wetland species around here. The back of the dam is covered with native warm season grasses, which are the fuel for once a year I start a fire at the bottom and it comes roaring up and toasts all of the woodies. And I have a lot of stuff that I've put in as live stakes that came from some project that didn't get used, and I jam them in the ground here and whatever. So we have the wildlife present use on the property, which is a present use value equivalent to agriculture or forestry, but you don't have to do forestry or agriculture. So you get the Wildlife Commission biologists to come out and they look for habitat, water features, diversity. Do you have nest boxes? So we have all of that stuff. You take the resulting report to the town tax office, and in January, and they say, yep, you qualify for reduced residential property tax. And we don't do it for the tax break, but I got the sign out there in front saying I qualify. We've also done prescribed burns here. So we burn everything from the bottom of the dam up. We burned like 4 times already, and it's kind of nice because there are places in the woods over there that the leaf litter was so thick nothing ever grew. But after the first burn, all of a sudden we've got New York fern coming up. We've got other things coming up. You wind up with acorns now can germinate because they're on the ground, and you wind up with young acorns coming in. So it's what you need for recruiting new plants for your canopy. I was the president of the Prescribed Fire Council years ago, and I met all the forestry guys and the state park guys, and it really helped plug me into like the longleaf pine stuff down east. You know, you need prescribed fire for that. Around here, people don't do much prescribed fire, but it is really an ecological tool that we should be using more.
I was going to ask you if you could say a bit about that for folks. Yeah. Maybe they've heard the term, or they're like, what's going on when they do that? Well, why do we need to do that?
Prescribed fire has a couple of motivations. Nowadays, the biggest motivation is to reduce fuel that builds up in the woods if you don't have fire. So Smokey the Bear is now, I think, 82 years old this year. And back when Smokey was first caught, he was an actual bear that got singed in a fire, and that's what made him the Forest Service's mascot. And back in the turn of the 1900 to 1930, there was huge fires out west because people had been suppressing fire for so long that fuel was building up. And we've had a couple of huge fires in the 80s in Yellowstone because out west, when a tree falls or a branch falls, it's so dry it doesn't rot. It just lays there and it waits for a lightning strike or something else. So if you look at North America, they have what they call the natural fire reoccurrence. And down in the coastal plain, natural fire reoccurrence is like every 1 to 3 years. And it would burn from Cape Fear River all the way to the PD and then go out. And you had species that were adapted to that, longleaf pine and Venus flytraps and all that other stuff. Well, it turns out the fire return interval around here is about every 10 years. So if you don't have a fire every 10 years, then you've got stuff building up. And the biggest problem we have nowadays is when we first moved to Stokes County, there were no mailboxes. Everybody was RFD, whatever. And they had to put street addresses on because that's how the EMS people find you. So what I thought were dirt roads leading into the woods, all of a sudden they had 8 mailboxes on them. And so people live in the woods all over in the Piedmont and in the mountains. And that's the biggest problem for the forestry people because every time there's a wildfire, the first thing people want to do is just let it burn itself out. But if there's houses in the way or power lines in the way, you got to do structural safety, damage prevention kind of stuff. So to do prescribed fire on a smaller scale helps remove all this extra vegetation and down stuff and gives seed bank a chance to do what the seed bank needs to do if it wasn't covered up by a foot of leaves. The U.S. Forest Service has something called the WUI, which is the Wildfire in the Urban Interface. And that's like, if you have a house in the mountains, you shouldn't really be putting landscaping right up against your house. And yeah, it looks good to have cedar shingles and have cedar siding, but maybe something more like cementatious hardy board and a metal roof would be fire tolerant. And you should also have a manageable area around where fire doesn't get to. So there's a lot of interest necessary now for especially mountain counties and things to have people aware of what they're doing in their landscaping that might cause a fire problem. Like piling up a bunch of pine needles against your base of your house is not a good idea. One spark hits that and you're toast. So a lot of the prescribed fire stuff is for fuel mitigation, and we burn with wildlife habitat because it makes more things growing on the ground, which is better for grazers. It thins out a lot of invasive species that aren't adapted to fire. So fire is a really good management tool. Plus, you can do fire a lot safer than you can if you were to, say, rake the whole thing or go in there manually, chop and chip. Fire is a lot easier, and certified to be a prescribed fire person means that you've been taught when to burn, humidity and temperature and wind direction. Also, transport winds. Does the smoke go up and then move, or does it blow horizontally? Wherever you're burning, you have to make sure you don't have a sensitive population downwind, like a nursing home or an elementary school or something. So prescribed fire management is all about smoke management, really, and making sure that you're not burning and it's really hot and overly dry and windy. So a little bit of wind is what you want, not a lot of wind and not gusty. And so there's a whole protocol to writing up a prescribed burn plan, what kind of weather parameters, where you're burning, what's in your neighborhood within a mile. Have you talked to the fire marshal and the county forester and all of those people? So it's a system. And, you know, many states, Florida does a lot of burning. South Carolina does a lot of burning. Eastern North Carolina does a lot of burning. In the Piedmont more and more, if we wanted to convert many of our Virginia pine patches to shortleaf pine. Shortleaf pine is the pine that'll grow for 300 years, and it's also fire resistant. Virginia pine is not. So I have a bunch of pines at the top of the hill where we dug the soil out for the dam, and I'm waiting for all the shortleaf to get big enough to run a fire through there, and I'll toast all the Virginia pines, and I'll be left with a thinned crop with fire resistant ones. So prescribed fire is a very good tool. We have probably 700 rare species of plants that are listed somehow in the state. Probably 2/3 of those are wetland plants, because we spent 300 years in this continent ditching and draining wetlands, which we're good at it, and so we've eliminated a lot of habitat. And then another third of those are fire requiring, like Schweinet sunflower and Georgia aster. And so the only place you find those now is like around Charlotte is all the power line cuts and the roadsides, because that's where there's disturbance that mimics fire. So it turns out that if you want to have a healthy population of Venus flytraps down around Wilmington, you have to be in a situation where you can burn through there, because otherwise you wind up with a thicket of stuff growing that shades the ground, and then Venus flytraps can't make it. So fire is a good management tool in longleaf pine and in coastal plain, and it's a good management tool around here too. So we burn it every 3 years. We burned it 3 times so far, so that qualified me for the sign up front. You know, it's something that the state is doing to promote prescribed burning. I could do a lot of it myself. When I usually do it, I usually like to get the county forester involved. I like to get some friends of mine who are state park rangers involved, and I help them on some of their fires, and they help me. You know, when you have 3 or 4 people doing the fire lines, and then you have a couple people drip torching, and we start at the top of the hill with the wind blowing uphill, and it just slowly creeps down the hill. And then around here, we can burn 18 acres in probably 2 hours.
Wow.
And then I have a tractor that I have a disc that I can mount a 100-gallon water tank with a little Honda pump, and I can take water out of my lake, and I can go around and put out all the little smokers and smolderers. So prescribed fire is a useful tool. My mother laughs because, you know, I was the kid who played with matches in the basement. So it's like, okay, that was job security. That was training.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how did you become a botanist? What led you to that?
playing in the woods as a kid. I grew up in a maple beech forest up in northern Ohio, and you could climb up to a beech tree and then segue over to the next, and we used to try to see how far we could go in any direction without touching ground. And sometimes it's like a mile or more until you run out of trees or whatever, but also just being the son of a gardener and the grandson of two grandmothers that were gardeners, and I mean, I'm really a plant physiologist by training. So my grandmothers who used to root rose cuttings, I was impressed to go to my grandmother's and see, she used mason jars, stuck her rose cuttings right in the ground, put a mason jar over to be like a little greenhouse, and she had these mason jars around her backyard, and sure enough, a certain percentage of them would root and she'd have cuttings. And in graduate school, I wanted to be a botanist. Didn't know really what that was going to be. Or in college, I wanted to be a botanist. So I took all the botany courses and horticulture. And I had a guy who taught greenhouse management. And I took a course from him. And he was the guy who always said, every time you go visit a botanical garden or a nursery, wear cargo pants and take a pocket knife and take samples. And so we all used to get off the bus from these trips from Ohio University, and these be all these kids wearing cargo pants. And we would be around clipping things and then go back to the greenhouse and root cuttings and all that stuff. I started graduate school for a guy who was at the time studying how to grow plants in space. This is in the days of Skylab, which was before the International Space Station. And so he studied how plants respond to touch. It's called thigmomorphogenesis. So he coined the term. Thigmo is touch, morpho is shape, and genesis is the change of. So how do plants change shape in response to touch? So you're talking about like Krumholtz things on the mountains that all flag, or you talk about stuff on the coast where there's a prevailing wind, but all the trees that are here have usually some measurable oval in their stem because the wind generally comes from the southwest. So all of the trees that you see here are going to have some sort of structural bracing, and that's all an ethylene modulated change in morphology. And we were doing experiments where my favorite experiment to tell young kids for science fair is get some green bean seeds, put them in a pot, germinate them. When the first node above the cotyledons comes out, take one of them and just put it between your fingers really lightly and rub that one once a day. The next one, rub it twice a day. The next one, rub it 3 times. The next one, rub it 4 times. And you'll wind up with plants. The more you rub them, the shorter and squatter they'll get, and the shorter the internodes and the thicker the leaves. And so it makes a nice natural graph. So that's all physiology. We got involved because it turns out during the Gemini series of NASA, they figured out that a lot of the things they were sending up to Skylab or growing in the Gemini capsules didn't grow as you would expect, even considering the microgravity, because solid state circuitry gives off ethylene. And ethylene is a plant hormone. Ethylene is the same plant hormone that, they harvest bananas green in Costa Rica, load them in a barge them up to New York. As they're pulling into harbor, they open up a couple of ethylene and acetylene tanks and pump ethylene into there. And so by the time they're unloading, the bananas have turned yellow. Or you can do it also with tomatoes. You can wind up with tomatoes that turn pink. But they're not, you can tell, they're greenhouse tomatoes. They're not ripe, they're not soft, and they're not sugary, but they're pink. So people think that's ripe. Those are all ethylene modulated biosynthetic pathways. So we were looking at how to test this ethylene thing, how to grow plants in space, what would you do? There's also engineers working on ethylene scrubbers and all sorts of stuff. It was a very interesting introduction into research. So I did that as an undergraduate. And then when my graduate professor, this is at Ohio University, he moved down here and moved all of us. I was a master's student at the time, moved all us in there. That's what got me here at Wake Forest, is moving as a new graduate student. So then I had to spend time figuring out what to do, and Wake Forest didn't offer any summer support for their graduate students. So I just got a summer job working for RJR Research. At the time, this was one of the biggest tobacco companies in the world, never had a botanist on board. It was all analytical chemists and product development guys and stuff. And they were looking at these Ames tests of mutagenicity, saying some of this stuff comes from the plant cell walls. And they wanted to hire somebody who could genetically modify or through plant breeding change the cell walls so that the pyrolysis products wouldn't be toxic in the Ames test, and or add more flavor to some kinds of tobacco so that they could have a proprietary line or whatever. It also turned out that some of the chemicals that are flavor precursors, that are the sticky glandular hairs, also happen to be the ovipositional cues of the tobacco hornworm moth. We had lines of tobacco that had sticky hairs but didn't have this chemistry in it, and others that had. And then you could take the plants that had the chemistry in it and wash it off with a solvent and put it on blotter paper, and then put the blotter papers out in the field with a crop of the chemistry deficient, and all the hardwood moths would lay their eggs on the paper and ignore the plant. So that was kind of the plant physiology part of my life, is doing analytical chemistry and plant breeding. And I was involved in a plant breeding study. We used to do our summer up here, plant breeding for tobacco things, and then we would take a winter crop down in Homestead, Florida. And I had a whole bunch of stuff in Homestead, Florida when Hurricane Andrew came by and just wiped the whole thing off the map. So came back after Hurricane Andrew and my key card didn't work in the door. In the time when I was camping out and trying to clean up the mess in Hurricane Andrew, the company had downsized, but I had already been volunteering at the local science museum, which is SciWorks, which is now Callidium. And they had a guy who was exhibits director there who was an artist and really good with color matching and rugs, but he didn't know science. So he couldn't write label copy for simple machines. He didn't know about endangered species. So they hired me to just be the science advisor, and I would write the label copy for the AIDS exhibit or write the simple machines or whatever. And then eventually the guy who was the artist, he got a job at the North Carolina Museum of Art, the job he really wanted. And then they promoted me from science advisor to exhibit director. And I did that for a couple of years until the woman came in the office one day and she said she wanted to use our auditorium to have a meeting to talk about the brand new land conservancy she was starting. Turns out it was really fortuitous because she came in the summertime, which the Science Museum is really science daycare. It's summer camp, which I hated summer camp. I mean, it was just running around with a bunch of screaming kids all day. It was not my idea of fun. I mean, we used to have a good time at the Science Museum, but summer camp was not that thing. So after the end of the meeting, I thought, I'd rather be working with her. So she hired me. I said, I'll do biological inventory work. That's what you're trying to raise money for. So then I spent probably 5 or 6 years just hiking around in everybody's woods. Back in the days that were pre-GIS, you had to take paper maps, topo maps into the tax office, copy, making up the scale to fit a property on a map. Then you go to the Farm Bureau and you look at your aerial photos. Where's their forest? Where's their not? And then you're carrying a camera with batteries, and you're carrying GPS unit with batteries, and you're carrying paper maps, and you're doing all this stuff. Now it's all on my phone as one. I mean, I have GIS software and camera and GPS coordinates and everything on my phone. So that was the days where I used to go through a lot of batteries. Because you would burn out a whole set of batteries a day for your camera and your GPS unit. But it was good field experience because it's the kind of job you're not going to outsource to Mumbai. The biggest part of doing inventory is trying to find where you can safely park your car to get into some place and, not have to cross like a field with a bull in it or, the guy with the hunting dogs or whatever. We used to send letters to people saying, we're going to come out and do inventory work, and if you have a problem, just let us know. And, about 60% of the people, they don't care. They want to come out. And then there's 20% of the people, they want to show you grandma's farm. They want you all day. You're going to show them, you're going to do everything. Then there's about 10% of the people which are hell no, I don't want the government on my property, but we put big X's on them. And then there's a small number of people who don't show the letter to their dog. So then the dog hasn't read the letter, doesn't know you're supposed to be there. So it turned out to be an interesting career choice over the years. So I went from inventory work to stream and wetland restoration to then full-time with the Land Conservancy. And now I'm on the part-time semi-retirement slide. I get calls constantly for people who want to save a piece of property. I send them the right way, or people who want me to be on a board or something. So I got a feeling my conservation career is not ending.
It was at this moment that we heard another interruption from one of our wildlife friends. Got somebody right above us here.
I just saw a sapsucker fly over to those trees, but it might have come over here.
Sounds like it's right above us there.
Right in here.
Yeah.
Yep.
For people who are wondering, what's an inventory? Cataloging everything in a piece of land? Is that the general idea?
It starts out with, what do we know about the county or the location first? The first place you always go is herbaria in state colleges or some other database that nowadays it's like iNaturalist or something. The first thing is you do the field work. So if somebody says, oh, here's a piece of property I want you to look at, the first thing I'm going to do is go look to see if I've got any records or somebody's got any records or samples from anybody who's ever looked there before. That's a good thing. Then I go and look at the geology and the soils maps, because the soils often tells you what might be there if it was undisturbed. Then I look for aerial photos to see if has it recently been disturbed. Aerial photos around here go back to about the 1920s. So the good ones start in like 1930 and pretty consistently every couple of years from 1940 on. So we can find out stuff that's happened in the last 80 years by looking at all the different aerial photos. Then there's watersheds. So if you're in a particular watershed, I can look up, what aquatic creatures are supposed to be there or where is the nearby stuff. So once you have all that in hand, that sort of tunes up your search image. So like for the Land Conservancy, for like a farm, it's helpful just to go out there blank and see what, if it looks like every other farm, that's fine. It's still got conservation value. Is it currently being used as a farm? Like wooded areas, we want to know, are there any rare things nearby? Even with farms, turns out, conservative group of people farmers are, mostly. And they don't really care about rare species until they're trying to get a USDA WIP or EQIP grant. Then all of a sudden, if you've got a cattle farm and you're in a watershed that's got a rare mussel, you get extra points for your cattle exclusion and your manure management plan that your guy in the next watershed wouldn't get. So then all of a sudden you can use rare plants as a carrot to get things done. Before I go out anywhere in the field, I'm going to at least look at aerial photos, see what's nearby, look at a topo map, bring up a digital elevation model and see, what are the slopes like. Particularly in the Piedmont, anything flat on the top or flat down in the floodplain has been plowed for 200 years. And you're not going to find much there. But if there's a north-facing slope, that's a good place to look. If it hasn't been logged recently, there might be some cool stuff there. Usually the south-facing hot slopes are not much going on. It just depends on what the topography is like, what the soils are like. South-facing slopes are good for exposed rocks, which might be interesting if you're looking for caves or something like that. So usually there's some pre-visit stuff that I do. When I was doing inventory work for the engineering company, we would get these calls and it'd be like English Construction, who's doing the Independence Street bypass around Charlotte. And they'd say, you got to come down here right away. We need to fill this hole. Hole could be a lot of things. Or, we're this place, we're going to dump a lot of dirt. We need to make sure there's nothing rare there. I get in the car, drive all the way down to Charlotte. They give you an address. I pull up, it's at high school. And they're going to put 5 feet of soil on top of the existing football field and just raise the football field. And my job is to fill out the form. There's no waters of the U.S., there's no wetlands, and there's no rare species. It's all fescue. I write up a species list and send it to the Army Corps, and it's got like one species on it, blue fescue. and you never know. And then sometimes I come down to a place near Ashboro, and there is a big hole, and I go down to the bottom and there's a little bit of a creek, but it's probably not jurisdictional, and I don't see any wetlands. And at the top of the road, just where I parked, is a line of 20 dump trucks waiting to dump. So then I come up to the top and I'm standing there looking, and they're all looking at me, and I thumbs up or thumbs down. And so a couple places it was thumbs down. And they said, okay, so I've saved a couple wetlands just by being the guy who said, probably going to cost you a lot of extra time and resources to do the permits to fill this. So if you could find some other place within a mile or two and drive your dirt there. And the other thing that happens is every time they put a bypass around, everywhere there's a bypass with an intersection, those corners on that intersection are now commercially developable if they're flat. So what the DOT normally does is they pick those corners, partially because of logistics, they can get on and off the freeway. That's where they go and dig soil that they use to fill something someplace else. But then that becomes a big flat spot, which now is potential for the Chewy Center or some other big box that shows up nowadays. There's been a couple places where I looked at a nice little wooded hillside, and I thought, I'm going to be the last guy ever to see this nice wooded hillside, because it's all going to get logged, and then they're going to take off 15 feet of dirt, and they're going to make what was a wooded hillside into this 4-acre flat spot, and then they're going to shell it, and there's going to be a Sheetz gas station there, and there's going to be some big box in the back. So sometimes it works in your favor and sometimes not. So that's kind of inventory, is get your mind thinking about what you might find, and then get your search image going and figure out what it's in relation to 2, and then go walk around.
You've been described as a conservationist by profession and an artist by passion. And art has come up a couple times in this conversation already, and I was wondering if you could talk about that aspect of being an artist.
I went to Elderberry Creek last weekend and sat there with my PLC t-shirt on and a little bit of watercolor, and I sold 5 paintings, and I didn't even have them priced. People wanted them, and we negotiated and sold. When the Land Conservancy was 10 years old, we hired some photographers, 2 photographers, a planted garden photographer and a wildlife photographer, big lens guy, and they did a coffee table booklet of the Piedmont Land Conservancy's first 10 years of projects. And then when we were 20 years old, we were thinking about what could we do to modify that, and it turns out there's a Piedmont Outdoor Painting Society, which is a bunch of landscape painters. So we put together a list of places that we were going to take the landscape people, and they painted paintings. So then we had the photographers from the first year's photographs, and we mixed the paintings up, and then we had a traveling exhibit that went around our 9 counties. So my job, just after I became full-time, was to take them, these group of ladies and one guy usually, and take them out in the field and, take them to Bethania and say, what do you want to paint? And one person always picks like a Bob Timberlake scene, a split rail fence with a quilt on it and an old enameled pot, and somebody else always takes a portrait of a cow or a dog or something. And there was a woman named Alexis Levine who lives on West Ridge Road in Greensboro and is a nationally and internationally known watercolorist. In 2 hours, she could paint a really nice watercolor of whatever. I mean, she's come out when I did prescribed burns and caught the smoke plume as a nice thing and whatever. So it turns out that she was always asking me questions while I was in the field about what are the veins on that leaf supposed to look like? How many flower parts? What do you call these different flower parts? If I paint them all the same size, that's what it really looks like, but I might want to make one bigger. So she offered classes at her studio on West Ridge Road. And so I said, well, how about if I start just taking classes and I'll learn a little bit more. And this is all about, again, your search image. So if you think about what you see and looking at what you see, to think about, well, what color are really shadows? I mean, people think about, well, I need to paint things black. Well, black doesn't really occur. So shadows are really like dark purple and dark blue and whatever. So I took maybe 10 years of Monday morning watercolor classes from Alexis, and then a couple other places I've gone to. Boone for a watercolor workshop, or West Jefferson has a nice place where there's a art studio there that does really nice 3-day workshops. So I find that it's just using another part of my brain. I think being a landscape painter makes me a more visually acute person in the field, and being a more detail-oriented naturalist makes me a better painter. So the two kind of go back and forth. I've had 5 or 6 solo shows and probably been involved in maybe 10 other shows. I've probably been painting 25 years now. I've probably sold 80 or 90 paintings. Some of them are kind of funny. I was in a show at the Center for Creative Leadership in Greensboro, and there was this pretty good sized painting of autumn Virginia creeper that my wife liked. And I said, I'm going to take that to the show. And she says, well, put a price on it that nobody will buy. So I would have normally sold it for $400 just because of the size. Watercolor paintings don't sell as expensively as others, and I don't have a name, so nobody really cares. So I put $800 on it. Well, somebody bought it. So then I had to paint another one for my wife. I made $600 last weekend on paintings that I didn't plan to sell.
Wow, that's awesome.
If you go to the Arts Place in Stokes County, I've got paintings there. I've had paintings in a gallery in Abingdon, Virginia, but I sell a lot of cards. So during the pandemic, I painted everything that came out of my garden every week. So I'd have, garlic and onions and broccoli and whatever. I just did a still life of whatever was coming out of the garden this week, and that turned into a series of cards that you can buy at the Arts Council that are my summer set. And every year I paint a watercolor of something for Luann and my Christmas card. So now I've got 15 or 18 of those. So those become Christmas cards. And then this time of year, I'm always doing autumn leaves. It's just a botanical geeky thing to do. So I do autumn leaves. So I've got an autumn set, and then I did some spring ones. So I got 4 seasons of cards that people use. And there's a college professor of mine, Pete Weigel, who just bought a big piece of property farm next to him and gave it to the Land Conservancy to turn into a new nature preserve. in Forsyth County, and he loves to use my watercolor cards as thank you notes and stuff, so I ship him off cards at a good discount, and he buys like 20 packs at a time. And I pick watercolor because you don't use solvents like oils. You don't have to worry about chemicals. It's not dusty like pastels. A couple years ago, Old Salem has a symposium every 2 years about something in the colonial garden. And they had a symposium about colonial naturalists and the illustrators that traveled with them. And so, John Bartram traveled all around the West, and he had a watercolor guy with him. Audubon was a watercolor guy and traveled, and those guys only had like blue, red, and yellow, and they mixed everything else.
That's right.
And so there was a really interesting thing about, there's a guy named John Abbott who was a school teacher in Georgia in a one-room schoolhouse in like 1820, and he had these little booklets that had watercolor paper, and he did life-size drawings of every insect that he could find, including using a brush that he made that only had one bristle so that he could draw the lines on a fly's wing. And his whole collection of art is 2 little pocket-sized notebooks, and you can use a hand lens on those things, and you can see all the details that you would see under any other real-life insect. And then there was David von Schweinitz, who is the father of American mycology. And we know he did mycology studies around here because there's a historic marker to him in Danbury on the way to Hanging Rock. And there was a woman named Flora Ann Bynum, who was the woman who started the Keep Old Salem neighborhood thing and turned it into Old Salem Inc. She was cleaning out an attic of an old house at one time and found these mushroom drawings with watercolor tinting. And it turns out they were David von Schweinitz originals that had been in attic in Winston-Salem for like 160 years when she found them. And Flora Ann Bynum was the woman who got Emily Allen into gardening because she was the garden guru back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I probably spend more of my time now, well, it's partially because I always have worked from home for the last almost 30 years. I don't have to spend a lot of time commuting.
You were working remote before it was all the rage.
I was, exactly, yeah.
Ken loves to share his conservation knowledge with others, and it's an inspiration to follow him on one of his many nature walks.
The other name for this is touch me not, so I just, by handling that, when see how it curled up? So this is an impatience pallida, but this is a good one to give this to a kid, and then as soon as they really start to look at it, just like that, hey, it's alive! Yeah, just like that, perfect.
I asked Ken to talk more about his experience giving talks, leading walks, and sharing his knowledge and love of nature with a wide range of people of all ages.
Usually, this time of year, I'm already getting calls for next year. So I'm going to be teaching the botany portion of a Master Gardener class to Surrey and Stokes County Master Gardeners because the Cooperative Extension people, the guy who's got any biology experience at all is a turf guy. And then garden clubs will start calling. So I usually do 3 or 4 garden clubs, some kind of thing. And I give the talks, and then I have them give a donation to the Land Conservancy. I like, if I can, share some of what I know with people who don't have the kind of experience I have. Like the Sierra Club in Forsyth County wants me to do another version of my biodiversity program. So I wind up with a lot of stuff on the schedule, and then I do a lot of hikes, probably 10 or 15 a year for the Land Conservancy. One of our clients has a natural, holistic neighborhood down in Franklinville, and he brings in like potters to do pottery and brings in herbalists to do herbal stuff, and then he wants me to do like a tree talk every couple of years. So I'll probably do something down at Harvey Harmon's place in Franklinville. It's kind of fun to do. I've never had a problem speaking in front of groups and speaking extemporaneously. I don't consider myself an educator. I probably wouldn't be doing the Master Naturalist thing if it wasn't for Chris. Chris is the guy who, I'll let him come up with curriculum. And my job was the field sites. So this weekend I'm doing the Ridges Mountain, Mount Shepherd thing all day Saturday, and then I'm leading a hike on Sunday afternoon to Cane Creek Mountain. I got a lot of weekend stuff, which is fine because then I'm all free during the week. And same thing with my wife. If we're going to be involved with something like Arts Council, we're not going to just be on the board and sit there and be quiet. We're going to be taking charge of something, making suggestions, getting votes happening, do stuff. So a lot of my modus operandi is just to be informing people what I think is important in the conservation world. I had a meeting with a garden club this week, and except for the trees, everything else was non-native. So I'm the native plant president, so I was a little bit irked about that and told them so. And they don't really understand the impact of climate change. They don't understand the impact of biodiversity loss. The World Wildlife Federation and the London Zoo did this meta-study of all these animal populations, and they published in 2015 that from 1970 to 2010, in that 40-year period, 60% of the animal life on Earth has disappeared. Then people went, that wasn't right, blah, 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 blah. And then they said, okay, we'll go back. So they did the same thing, and I think like National Geographic and somebody from AAAS showed up. And so they redid it, republished in 2022. They said, we made an error. It's 66%. And then we figure, well, if you think about it, at 1970, we probably already lost half of the wildlife that would have been there from before the Industrial Revolution. When I was doing the inventory in Forsyth and Guilford County, there was a woman named Ramona Snavely who used to live in Forsyth. And she had been birding and keeping good records since 1950 all the way through the 1980s. So she had these great records. In the 1950s, cedar waxwings would come by in a flock of 10,000 birds. Nowadays, if 12 cedar waxwings land in Guilford Courthouse, it goes on eBird, and every birder in the neighborhood gets an orgasm and runs over to Guilford Courthouse. We don't have the number of, rose-breasted grosbeaks that used to come through, and cedar waxwings or whatever they are. When I was the chair of the Wildlife Non-Game Advisory Committee for the Wildlife Commission, that put me in touch with all these people who do migratory bird stuff. One guy stationed down in Columbia, another guy stationed somewhere in Arkansas on the flyway, and then whatever. People now do it by radar and whatever all else. In Guilford County, there are wetlands that I know of that when I was doing inventory work back in 92, 3, 4, I could find marbled salamanders and spotted salamanders and interesting things and frogs and whatever. And I go back there now and I don't find hardly anything. And this is like in my short career, things have declined. So I think we're talking about what we should be doing land conservancy-wise. I tell them, I don't wake up in the morning thinking that anybody actually intentionally goes out to destroy the environment. Yeah, it's possible that there's some that do, but it turns out everybody does it by their own unintentional mindlessness. There was a comedian that I saw, and he was posting this video saying, we were all thinking about what we could do for the environment, and we all went out and we brought our own bags to the grocery store. We thought that would work. And what else? Well, that's about it. That's about all we did. So I think just telling people about things like decline of biodiversity, climate change is affecting their gardens. It's affecting their birds. It affects their health. We now have malaria and yellow fever back in North Carolina that was gone. We have anopheles and zebra mosquitoes bringing in encephalitis and other things. And then I tell them, you're in Guilford County. In 10 years, you'll all have to be dealing with armadillos. Just because the ground doesn't freeze, they're moving north, they can still forage in the wintertime. The other thing is we're going to have fire ants in Guilford County. You're going to have to take these things into consideration. Those are climate change driven changes in plant and animal species. It's incumbent upon me, because I have some inside knowledge being with the Wildlife Commission and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Prescribed Fire Council, that we always, in these agency meetings, we all talk about this. But nobody really goes and tells the little old ladies who are going and buying invasive plants in the garden shop. It gets back to that issue that you're probably well aware of, that scientists need to be thinking about how they can talk to non-scientists. Otherwise, we're not connecting the dots. So I spend a lot of my time connecting the dots, and if I can get somebody to give a $50 donation to the Land Conservancy, fine. So I do 3 or 4 or 5 of those a year. I do probably 3 or 4 walks in garden clubs that come to Emily Allen's a year. I speak at Sierra Club meetings, Forsyth Audubon meetings, T. Gilbert Pearson. Now I'm on a committee to help raise funds for preserving Guilford Woods, which is a 250-acre woods that is owned by Guilford College. All the small colleges have had financial problems. And at some point I've thought some bean counter is going to want to sell Guilford Woods because it's really...
Don't do it. Don't do it. No.
They would love to do it, except every alum would come and chain themselves to a tree. The thing that's cool about Guilford Woods, it's also one of the nodes on the Underground Railroad. just like Krosnor, that was a big Methodist church farm in Winston-Salem within spitting distance of downtown skyscrapers that we've been looking at for like 30 years. Somebody's got to protect this, otherwise it's going to be turned into something else that we don't want. And it took the Methodist church selling the property to Krosnor, and Krosnor finally thinking, well, maybe we could monetize this development rights. We'll get the development rights, but we'll keep the property. That's the whole point. Same thing with Guilford College. So, we're talking about for a 150-acre easement, probably looking at between $12 and $15 million worth of money raised. So I've done a lot of stuff at Guilford Woods over the years, and my long-term goal is to connect Price Park to Guilford Woods, along the backside of Guilford Woods, where the pine trees are falling on private property, cut a big corridor, put a greenway in, run the greenway down Jefferson, and then to Friendly, and then into Starmount. So Starmount to Price Park will be hopefully a corridor at some point. A lot of it is just making people aware of things that otherwise they're not aware of.
I asked Ken to talk about any of the big problems or wicked challenges he's wrestling with right now in his conservation work. Are things like rapid biodiversity loss the kind of issue that's keeping him up at night?
It used to, before about 2004, when I met the Dalai Lama and became a more or less practicing Buddhist, spent times in retreats, and the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. Buddhism is actually a philosophy and not a religion. And the first thing is suffering happens, get used to it. The second thing is most of the suffering you do yourself by things you're attracted to you want or things you're averse to that you don't want. There are ways of fixing that aversion and distrust and whatever. And then there's the Eightfold Path, which is get the right kind of job, have the right kind of attitude, be aware. So once you start to think about it in a little more like engaged Buddhism, is everything is impermanent anyway. Humans can screw up all they want in the world and Mother Nature's going to be fine in the long run, even if we have to go away. But I think that part of it is just be thinking about it's not my place to worry about things that I can't control. So I don't spend a lot of time being awake at night for those kind of reasons or any other kind of reasons. So, that's the benefit of having a philosophical grounding that says things are impermanent, change is natural, don't worry about it, you're only going to cause yourself suffering.
I also asked Ken to talk about what's giving him hope.
I always tell people, especially these like garden clubs, I said, we don't intentionally go out to make havoc in the world, we do it unintentionally. So if you flip that over and all of a sudden you become more intentionally mindful, then you can start thinking about what do you buy, who do you vote for, how do you use resources, what's your lifestyle like, are there ways that you can make that so that it works more in Mother Nature's favor? That's what we need to be thinking about, is just little things that we can be mindfully aware of, and it might involve bringing your own bags, it might involve getting a hybrid car, it might involve living in a solar house, all that kind of stuff. If people that are not mindful are just made aware that they can be mindful, then that automatically makes things easier to happen in the right way. So I just always am hopeful that people are going to be more mindful, especially these little old ladies. When I start talking about your kids and your grandkids, they're all like, they sit up and they pay attention. It's the next generation. What are we doing this generation that the next generation is going to blame us for or be glad we did? So that's kind of where we are, is if we can all be a little bit more mindful of, the Land Conservancy, what we do is try to save bits and pieces of the environment so that there's enough ecological function so that Mother Nature can have a functional ecology, then everybody wins.
Thanks so much to Ken for being on this episode and sharing so much of his insight and experience. That's a wrap for our show today. I appreciate you giving the Roving Nature Podcast a listen, and I hope you'll share it with others who might be interested. All episodes are available on www.rovingnature.net, where you'll also find a blog, social media links, and nature-related news and resources. Stay tuned for more episodes to come, and in the meantime, I encourage you all to get out in nature when and where you can, even if it's only a few minutes a day and just outside your door. Learn about and get involved with your local nature and conservation organizations and help support local and national legislation that will help protect our precious natural resources. I'd like to give a huge shout out to local singer-songwriter Abigail Dowd for letting me use her lovely song Beautiful Day as the theme music on today's show. You'll find links to Abigail's artist and album websites and her Instagram on this episode page and on the Roving Nature website.